One of the most important components of chess is active defense, and the game I'm gonna show you illustrates its magic nature. The world champion Anatoly Karpov exerts tremendous pressure on Taimanov's position and is ready to start a decisive pawn storm. Taimanov doesn't have any counterplay and his position looks completely hopeless. But then the magic begins. Taimanov transforms matter into spirit, namely by sacrificing material, he activates his pieces and grabs the initiative. Now Karpov's position becomes critical, and Taimanov finishes the game with one of the most beautiful combinations of his career. Karpov starts with e4, Taimanov plays the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, and Taimanov plays a6, taking under control the b5 square. Karpov opts for the Maroczy bind, taking under the full control the central d5 square, and after finishing the development, Karpov is going to gradually squeeze his opponent. Taimanov plays e5, eternally weakening the d5 square, but getting the dynamic play and the control over the important d4 square. Now the best move according to the theory is knight f5, but in our game Karpov opted for knight b3 instead. The idea is to take under control the c5 square in order to prevent the black bishop from invading it. Taimanov develops his knight, attacking the pawn, Karpov defends it, knight c3, and bishop b4, pinning the knight. That means the pawn again is under attack. And Karpov, of course, consolidates his center, f3. Taimanov castles kingside. Karpov develops his dark squared bishop, d6, opening the light squared bishop's diagonal, and Karpov plays rook c1, defending his knight, and he's going to play a3, forcing the black bishop, which would be under attack, to capture on c3, after which white would recapture with the rook, retaining his pawn structure and getting the advantage of two bishops, because after a3 the bishop cannot retreat to c5, as c5 is controlled by the white knight and the bishop twice. And the white controls this square only once with the d6 pawn. That's why, in the anticipation of a3, Taimanov plays b6, so that the bishop can retreat to c5 and is protected twice by the both of his pawns. Karpov develops his light squared bishop, and the bishop retreats to c5. Now, in case white captures the bishop, and sooner or later white will have to capture this strong piece, black would recapture, and after that both of his pawns, the e5 pawn and the pawn that will appear on c5, will control the important central square. Karpov develops his queen, bishop e6 follows, and Karpov finally captures this bishop, and b takes c followed. Now both pawns control the d4 square, and that means the knight can jump on this square, and the knight will dominate the center on this square, of course. And in case white exchange the knight, one of the black pawns will recapture, and black will get the protected passed pawn on d4, which will be very strong. Besides that, the b file has turned into a half-open file, and black will exert some pressure on this file. Karpov castles kingside, and knight d4 followed. But Karpov also has a great square for his knight, so he centralizes his knight too. And Taimanov now writes in his annotations that he didn't like bishop g5 next move. So by playing bishop g5, Karpov can pin the knight, and the knight will be attacked twice in this case, and that might be quite unpleasant. And he also didn't like the variation arising after knight takes d5, because in this case, after c takes d, the bishop must retreat, and Karpov has a strong move b4, breaking black pawns. So either white will capture on c5, and after d takes c, black will get a weak isolated pawn on c5, or in case black himself captures on b4, then the pawn would disappear from c5, and the only defender of the knight would be the e-pawn, and that means white can capture the knight, and after black recaptures with the pawn on d4 would be weak. So, in order to prevent the pin, instead of capturing on d5, Taimanov retreats his knight to d7. And Karpov starts the expansion on the king side, f4. and he's going to play f5, getting the space advantage on the king side. In case black captures on f4, again the pawn disappears from e5 and the knight isn't sufficiently defended. White would simply capture it, and after c takes d, queen takes f4, the d4 pawn is weak and it will fall. That's why after f4, Taimanov plays rook b8, occupying the half-open file. And, of course, f5 followed. Now white has the space advantage on the king side, and black is forced to give up his bishop. Bishop takes d5, c takes d. Taimanov plays queen b6, threatening to capture the pawn. That's why rook f2, defending it. And in order to prevent the white pawn from moving to f6, that was the possible continuation. In this case, after black captures on f6, white can sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes f6, and after g takes f, black's pawn structure on the king side would be damaged, and that might be quite dangerous. White might start a very strong attack. So to prevent it, Taimanov himself plays f6, blockading the f-pawn. Now, the most natural plan for white would be, of course, the pawn storm on the king side. So, white can simply play g4, rook g2, maybe even king h1, rook g1, doubling on the g-file, followed by g5, and the attack would be very strong. But Karpov finds a more sophisticated plan. Before the pawn storm on the king side, he wants to tie the black pieces to the defense of the queen side, because black has a weakness on the queen side. The pawn, the a6 pawn, which is currently attacked once, but it will be attacked more times, because the rook joins the attack. Rook c4. The rook, of course, is heading to a4 in order to exert more pressure on this pawn. Taimanov moves the pawn away from the light-squared bishop's diagonal. a5. Of course, rook a4 followed. Now the pawn is attacked twice, while it's defended only once, so the rook must leave the half-open file to defend the pawn. Now a very original maneuver follows. Queen e1. The queen is still attacking the pawn, but vacates the d2 square for the bishop, after which the pawn will be attacked for the third time. That's why Taimanov plays rook a7, vacating the a8 square for the second rook to defend the pawn. Of course, bishop d2 right away would be a mistake, because the bishop would close the rook's way and the pawn would be unguarded. Black would simply capture it. That's why first Karpov plays b3, defending the pawn. And now Taimanov plays rook a8, defending the pawn. Again, bishop d2 would have been premature, because black has a combination, the knight sacrifice, and after queen takes b3, both the rook and the bishop are attacked. That's why first Karpov plays rook b2, defending the pawn. And next move, of course, after queen c7, he plays bishop d2. And we have reached the critical position. White has exerted tremendous pressure on the pawn. It's attacked 3 times, and it's defended also 3 times. And black major pieces, the queen and the both rooks, are tied to its defense. And all black pieces, as you see, are placed on the queen side. So that means the king side is vulnerable, and the black pieces cannot take part in the defense of the king side, because in this case the pawn on a5 would fall. So now Karpov is ready to start the pawn storm on the king side. Karpov is going to play bishop c3, opening way for his rook to the king side. After that, he will play g4. The rook from b2 will move to g2. After that, the bishop from c3 will return to d2 and also take under control the g5 square. And after g5, white's pawn storm on the king side would be decisive. And it isn't clear how black can prevent this devastating plan. However, now the magic begins. The active defense starts. You can pause the video and try to find how Taimanov activated his pieces and grabbed the initiative. He did it by sacrificing the pawn on a5, playing knight b6, attacking the rook, and also taking under control the c4 square, which is very important, as you will see. However, the knight stands right in front of the queen. That means the queen isn't defending the pawn anymore, and white can capture it. Of course, white cannot capture with the bishop, which at first sight looks tempting, as the bishop is pinning the knight, but it turns out that black can sacrifice the queen for the two rooks, first capturing the first rook, and then the second rook. Besides that, both bishops would be attacked and one of them would fall. That's why Karpov, of course, captures with the rook. Rook takes a5. Now he is up a pawn. But the active defense continues. The knight also took under control the c4 square, so the pawn moves to c4, attacking the bishop, and also as the pawn has left the c5 square, the diagonal on which the white king stands is open now, and that's very dangerous. So, what can white do? White has a couple of options, but it turns out, a couple of active moves, but neither of these moves works. For example, in case white captures on a7, then of course simply queen takes a7 and the queen is on this diagonal, and that would be simply deadly, because white doesn't have time to move away the king as his bishop is under attack. And after white captures the pawn, simply the knight moves away from the queen's way to a4 with a tempo attacking the rook. And besides that, black has a deadly threat, knight f3 with the double check, discovered check, and a fork. White is losing the queen. In case white captures on c4 with the bishop, then of course simply knight takes c4. The knight has moved away from b6, opening the queen's way. That means the rook is attacked 3 times, while it's defended only twice. So white doesn't have time to capture the knight. White must capture the rook. And of course, again, queen takes a7, and again, black's threat is deadly. Knight f3, winning the queen. And finally, in case white captures on c4 with the pawn, then rook takes a5, bishop takes a5, and now queen c5. Again, the queen is on this diagonal, knight f3 check is threatened, and the bishop is under attack. It's attacked twice. White must capture the knight, but still knight f3, it's a double check, so white doesn't have time to capture the queen. The king must move, and knight takes e1. After bishop takes c5, knight takes d3 with a fork, and white is losing one of these pieces, so of course white is losing in this variation. That's why after c4, Karpov made the only move. Bishop must retreat to f1. Now, rook takes a5 followed, bishop takes a5, and queen c5. Again, the queen is on this diagonal, and white must give up his dark squared bishop, after which the dark squares on white's territory will be weakened. Bishop must capture on b6, and queen takes b6 followed. Now again, knight f3 check is threatened, winning the queen. That's why Karpov moves his king to the corner of the board. And Taimanov captures on b3, and after a takes b, the a file opens for his rook, and his rook becomes very active. So, the active defense is over. And now we can see its results. Black has a dominating centralized knight on d4 against the passive light-squared bishop, which isn't doing much, which is a bad bishop because white pawns are on the light square, so the bishop is bad. The queen and the rook, the white queen and the rook, are passive, while the black rook is very active, and the queen is also quite active, and later in the game it will become even more active, as you will see. Besides that, white doesn't have his active plan anymore, because the pawn storm doesn't make any sense anymore, because white doesn't have sufficient attacking resources, of course. So, white has an extra pawn on b3. That's the only thing white has, but of course, as black pieces are very active, black has very strong initiative, and that's more than enough compensation for the pawn. However, the problem for black is that white doesn't have any weaknesses in his position. So black will create a weakness now. The weakness will be the d5 pawn, which is currently defended by the e4 pawn. But black will eliminate the e4 pawn, after which the d5 pawn will turn into the target of attack. g6, threatening to capture twice on f5 and win a pawn. That's why Karpov captures on g6. After h takes g, we can see that the h file has become a half-open file, and that will be very important in the end of the game, as you will see. The only plan Karpov has is to move his passed pawn, of course. He doesn't have any other active plan. That's why he plays b4. King g7 followed, b5, and f5. Now the pawn, the e4 pawn, will disappear and the d5 pawn will become weak. E takes f, knight takes f5. And black also has unpleasant threats. For example, knight e3 can be unpleasant, attacking the d5 pawn. The rook might invade the third rank, which can also be unpleasant. In order to prevent both of these threats, Karpov plays rook b3. However, his first rank is weak, and the king doesn't have a luft, and the queen is vulnerable, of course. That's why instead of rook b3, Taimanov in his annotations recommends rook b1. But Karpov plays rook b3. Now it's time to centralize the queen. Queen d4, attacking the pawn and taking under control the a1 square, threatening to invade a1 with the rook. Karpov, however, as the black queen has left the blockading b6 square, moves his pawn further. So he hopes to divert the black pieces from their activity by moving the pawn further. He needs just 2 moves to promote the queen. However, the b6 move turned out to be a decisive mistake. Because, of course, Taimanov plays rook a8, but it seems that Karpov wasn't scared of this move because he can simply play rook b1. But it turns out that now Taimanov has a brilliant combination which Karpov missed. And after Taimanov's next move, Karpov immediately resigns. And you can pause the video one more time and find his brilliant combination. So, the white king doesn't have any squares to move because the g1 square is controlled by the black queen. And the h file is half open. So, Taimanov opens it completely by sacrificing the knight. Knight g3 check. The only 2 options white has is to capture the knight either with the pawn or the queen. If the queen captures, of course, the rook falls. And besides that, black is up the exchange. Besides that, there is no way to defend the bishop. The only way is queen f3, of course, but in this case, e4 attacking the queen, and after queen e2, queen d3, black is threatening to capture the queen, so white must capture himself, and the black pawn promotes to the queen. But what if the pawn captures the knight? In this case, the h file completely opens, and the rook would return to a8, followed by deadly rook h8 checkmate, and there is nothing white can do against it. That's why, after knight g3 check, Karpov resigned. And now I recommend watching Taimanov's romantic masterpiece, in which he sacrificed the queen to initiate a deadly attack. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.